Soundbonnet Kings and Queens. I want to talk to you this morning about something that's on my mind, something that a lot of people are talking about, what's trending in the aftermath of what Jada Pinkett Smith had to say about boycotting the Oscars, but not just boycotting the Oscars, because she went a little more in depth dealing with how black people need to value, esteem, and love ourselves, and not keep looking to other races for them to validate us, accept us, and make us feel like we have some sort of worth. So in the backlash of that, Janet Hubert, the woman who originally played the Aunt Viv on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, she took to social media, to Facebook, to Twitter, and put together a video telling people not to boycott the Oscars and accusing Will and Jada of quite a few things. I don't know if any of those things are true. I'm not going to deal with the factuality of those things or the infactuality of those things. We're just going to deal with the bigger picture here. Now, in this video, I'm going to say a few things about some of our black leaders in history that have been used as house niggers. And when I say house niggers, it's not just to, use a derogatory term, but to understand the concept of what the job, the duty of the house nigger was. So we got to go right back to slavery before we can even get into the 2016 house niggers. Now, the job of the house nigger was basically to keep the field slaves in line and to preserve the rule of the slave master. So the house slave, I don't want to keep calling nigger, so the house slave job was to keep the people in the field in order and to preserve the rule and the possessions of the slave owner. So therefore we had almost 300 recorded slave rebellions. The slaves that were uprising and fighting for their freedom, and almost all of which were thwarted by black house slaves or someone in the field who had a house slave mentality, someone who wanted to further the rule and protect the property of the master. So when the slaves would decide that they want to rise up and fight against the master in order to liberate themselves, these house slave mentality Negroes would go to the masters and let them know about these plans so they can keep the plans from happening and stay in slavery. And when we think about that, that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You're thinking about this liberation is going to liberate you also, but you have been programmed and have such an allegiance to the slave master that you will keep yourself and your people from being liberated because you want to further the rule of the slave master. So let's stay in history for some time. Let's look at man by the name of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And Marcus Garvey believed in one God, one aim, and one destiny. And his mantra was Africa for the Africans. And he wanted to liberate Africa as a continent in order to create a government, because there was no unified government of Africa. And one of the things Marcus Garvey taught is, so if you look around the world, so in the United States, they're not going to do to a Chinese people what they do to black people, because if they would do so, then China is going to have an issue with the United States and even threaten to do something to the United States. They're not going to do what they do to black people to Iranians, because the president of Iran, he ain't playing, or the people from North or South Korea, they're not going to do anything to those people in the magnitude of what they do to us, because they have countries that represent them or that they represent that will stand on their behalf. And the problem with black people in the United States is we don't have a country, a government, or a continent that is speaking on our behalf to let the United States know you're not going to treat our people that way. So Marcus Garvey came up with this idea of creating this government and it was he started it through the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and he's creating this government. In the 1920s, he amassed over 15 million followers on 38 different countries all across the world, and he had his base here in the United States. And he even had become a somewhat the president of Africa, because even those in Africa were following him because he was trying to liberate them. So now, as he's building this large army of black people, he's bringing people self-awareness. He's bringing people self-reliance. He's helping them to love themselves. And his only desire, it wasn't to take over the United States. It wasn't to overthrow the government. It was to help build a black economy for black people, so we didn't have to take handouts from anybody else. This is all he wanted to do, and this is exactly what Jada is talking about in her video, us building our own and not needing the Oscars, but if we have our own award shows, our own everything, we don't need a handout from somebody else to validate us. So now Marcus Garvey has these over 15 million followers in the 1920s, and I know the first thing I thought was, well, what happened? Well, one of our prestigious leaders, W.E.B. Du Bois, a man who was held in high regard, a man who was a part of the NAACP, made sure that this did not come to fruition. And in that sense, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, whether knowingly or unknowingly, was a house nigger. He made sure that the blacks were not united. He made sure that they did not get their own economy and have their own government in Africa. And he worked with Edgar J. Hoover in order to bring down the UNIA and all of its members and everything that they meant. And the only thing our Garvey wanted was Africa for the Africans, which makes sense. And still to this day, Africa is ruled and governed and colonized by other countries as opposed to ruling and controlling their own continent. And these other countries are using them to steal their gold, their minerals, their diamonds, and everything else that's in Africa. So the leader, the man that we have come to know and to love as W.E.B. Du Bois, was a house nigger in essence, by what he did and how it thwarted the liberation of black people. Now, fast forward some time to the 1960s, a man who I still hold in great esteem, a man who I did so many book reports on in life because I was just gravitated to him, was Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, who for some years, in essence, was a house nigger. Why? Because he wasn't building up the black people to have their own. He was trying to get the black people to be accepted by white media. And I know it's just Martin Luther King Day yesterday, and some people might be upset at that, but let me just go further. Towards the end of his life, Martin began to change his ideologies, and eventually that's what got him killed. In the last conversation he had with Harry Belafonte records that Martin Luther King said to him, "I fear I have integrated my people into a burning building." And Belafonte asked him, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And I'm going to paraphrase it here so we can really get what it is. Martin said it very eloquently, but I'm going to break it down so you really get what it is. Martin basically said to Harry Belafonte, "I thought these white people had some morals that I could lean on and get them to treat us right. But I found that these white people don't have any morals." Therefore, from that point forward, Martin was no longer an integrationalist because he realized that it was impossible to integrate with a people that hate you. But for so many years, he had already pushed this agenda of integration, and the integration was a great tool for white people because it allowed them to take our money without accepting us. And it's appeared to be integration, but when we look around, we're still not integrated. There's still white neighborhoods and there's still black neighborhoods. There's still places where white people go and where black people go. I was just with a brother of mine from Building Better Men, and we were riding down 18th Street. We get to Rittenhouse, and it's a hotel, and it says Barclays Private Dinners. Now, when we look at private dinners, I guarantee you one thing: black people are not involved in that number of private. So things are still segregated. We just aren't strategically segregated. So white people took the I Have a Dream speech, and that's the only speech that they've really given us from Martin Luther King. They've elevated and given us Martin Luther King, but they brung Malcolm X down. Why? Because Malcolm X was talking about loving your blackness. Malcolm X was talking about black nationalism and depending on ourselves. But what they showed us from Martin Luther King was only him saying we need to be accepted by white people. We need to be a part of white people. So they kept Malcolm down and pushed Martin up simply because it wasn't about building the black person to be self-reliant. But again, Martin, towards the end of his life, began to change his ideology to move from what is, in essence, a house nigger mentality to a powerful black man's mentality. And really what happened, he called Malcolm, his phone was tapped. And he called Malcolm and told Malcolm, we got to get together and work this thing out. And just in a few weeks after that phone call, they killed Malcolm X because they could not allow the great following Martin had to connect with all of the ideologies of Malcolm, because if that would have happened, then we would have been able to liberate ourselves a long time ago. So now, fast forward to where we find ourselves today with Janice Hubert versus Jada Pinkett. So now, this is the thing you really got to look at. Because Martin was used, W.E.B. Du Bois was used. There were a plethora of people that were used against the Black Panthers, all of them which were black. And what they do, what the white supremacists do, is if a black person takes a stand in order to liberate or build up their people, they know they can't get up and tell you not to do it. So they'll find a black person that they can use in order to undo everything you just learned from another black person. So if Jada comes and says, black people, we need to love ourselves. We need to invest in ourselves. We need to invest in our own businesses. We need to stop worrying about how white people feel about us, but that we should love ourselves so much that we're going to build our own stuff. The white supremacists cannot have that because they'll lose power over us. So they use the coon, the house nigger, who is in essence today Janice Hubert, to come and undo us. Now, understand this. I don't know if any of you knew her name. I didn't. I did not know her name. The last time I saw her was years ago on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But all of a sudden, boom, she's going viral. Now, I can't believe she had more than 500 followers on Twitter, because I don't know, nobody knew her. How all of a sudden does this person who has been invisible for years mysteriously just jump into the news feed of everybody else with this message? It's because she is being used to undo what Jada was trying to talk to us. And when we're looking at what's going on, I talked to my cousin. She says, well, she has valid points on what she's saying. And I don't deny that she might have some valid points. Yes, we should be concerned with black on black violence. And yes, we should be concerned with poverty. And yes, we should be concerned with all of these things. But when you look at the crux of what Jada was talking about, it was not about the Oscars. The Oscars are what it stemmed from, because it made a platform to show us the visibleness of this systemic racism. So we can see that for the past 2 years, they will not acknowledge the work of black people. So now she can use that as a platform for us to deal with the bigger issue. And the bigger issue is black self-hate and the way we idolize and have been conditioned to idolize white people, white achievement, and white awards, and the way we feel as though we need them in order for us to be something. So now, if we look at the crux of what Jada is asking us to do, she is asking us to invest in ourselves, to believe in ourselves, and to not be dependent upon anybody else but ourselves. Great message. Now, so let's deal with the messages. So what is Jane Hubert essentially telling us to do? She says, you actors, don't y'all let Jada make y'all turn y'all back on Massa, because y'all been making a good living off of Massa doing these movies, and she's trying to take that from you. This is what she's saying. Don't let Jada convince you to boycott the Oscars and start your own movie companies and start your own award shows, because the white people that you've been working for all this time have been treating you good. If that's not house nigger stuff, there ain't no such thing as a house nigger. So this is what her goal is. Her goal is to stay under the thumb or what she's teaching us to do, is to stay under the thumb of white supremacists who will not acknowledge our achievements, who still are historical achievements, to stay under the thumb of a white system that will not allow but 3 or 4 black actors at a time to be in mainstream movies. She is telling us to stay under that as opposed to listening to what Jada is saying to build all of our own stuff. That doesn't make sense to us. And that's when you can tell a 2016 house nigger in essence. If a black person stands up and talks about how we should build ourselves up, and then another black person comes behind them and tell you that's not necessary, that is a house nigger. If a black person tells you that we need to strategically segregate, build our own communities so we can have our own police force that won't kill us, so we can have our own businesses that will hire us and will put money back into our communities. If a black person comes behind them and says, we don't need segregation, we don't need our own businesses, that's a house nigger. Because when you look at the crux of the messages, what is it teaching you to do and how can it benefit you? How can what Janice Hubert is teaching benefit the black actors? And we look at Jesse Williams. If you look him up on YouTube, the guy from Grey's Anatomy, he's half black, and he talked about how he says, I got 5 personal friends, black actors, who have to choose between paying their mortgage or being on TV cast as a black man robbing some white person or some other stereotypical black individual just shucking and jiving as a coon. Because the industry, if you look around, especially for men, how many movies are we allowed to see that has a positive, assertive male black man? You're not going to see those things because that's not the image they want to perpetuate. And this is what Janet Hubert is telling us to stay under, as opposed to Jada Pinkett saying, listen here, we got to control our own stuff so we can put out our own message, we can have our own control, and we can make sure we help employ our own people. So if any black person ever